The pitchfork was at Clyde Donnelly's throat before he had fully stepped through the barn door, and he stopped moving with the particular stillness of a man who had survived worse surprises than this one. "Not one step closer," said the voice behind the pitchfork, and it belonged to a woman, though there was nothing soft in it. "I have buried better men than you for less than trespassing on my land." Clyde kept his hands loose at his sides, palms open, the way he might approach a spooked horse or a rattler sunning itself on a warm rock. Late September had turned strange this year, days still holding on to summer's heat while the nights dropped hard toward frost, and the inside of the barn smelled of old hay and cold iron and something else underneath it, something like blood. "I'm not here to trouble you, ma'am," he said. "I own this barn, or the ground it sits on leastways. Bought the parcel 3 weeks back from a man in Ellsworth who never mentioned a building on it." The pitchfork did not waver. In the gray light leaking through the boards, he could make out dark hair escaping from beneath a kerchief, a jaw set hard enough to crack walnuts, and eyes the color of a storm still deciding whether to break. She was younger than her voice had suggested, maybe 25, but there was nothing young about the way she held that fork, like she had used tools for hard purposes before and would not hesitate to again. "Then you will forgive me if I do not simply take your word," she said. "Men lie about land all the time in this country. They lie about wells too, and about who dug them, and who has the right to draw water from them." "I have not said one word about wells," Clyde said carefully. "No," she agreed. "You have not, yet." Behind her in the deeper shadow of the barn something moved, a groan, low and pained, human. Clyde's eyes flicked past her shoulder and he saw the shape of a body laid out on a horse blanket, one leg bound with strips of torn cloth, dark with old blood not yet fully dry. "That man needs a doctor," Clyde said. "Not much a barn can do for a wound like that." "That man is my cousin," the woman said, and something in her voice cracked just slightly, a hairline fracture in granite. "Thomas. He fell from the loft of our own barn 2 counties over trying to fix a hole in the roof before the first freeze, and I could not carry him alone the whole way to town, and I was not about to leave him on the open road for whatever passes through these parts at night. This barn was empty. I thought it abandoned." Clyde studied her. Studied the boy on the blanket, sweat-sheened despite the cold, his legs swollen and wrong beneath the bindings. Studied the wagon he could now make out through the far door, half hidden behind a stand of dead sumac, one wheel cracked. "You are not a thief," he said. "I did not ask for your opinion on the matter." "No," he agreed, and something in him, something that had spent 15 years reading trail sign and worse things than trail sign, decided that this woman was telling the truth, or near enough to it that arguing would waste time neither of them had. "But your cousin's leg is broke bad, and if that wound festers he will lose more than the leg. I have carried men out of worse country than this. Let me help." The pitchfork lowered slow, like she was setting down a weight she had been carrying far longer than the last hour. "Why would you help a stranger who nearly gutted you?" Clyde allowed himself the smallest smile, the kind that did not reach much past the corner of his mouth. "Ma'am, I have known plenty of strangers a good deal less honest than a woman who threatens a man's life to protect her family. Seems to me that is exactly the kind of person worth helping." She looked at him a long moment, weighing something behind those storm-colored eyes, and then she set the pitchfork against the wall. "Winifred Wilcox," she said, "and you had better be as good with a wounded leg as you are with words, Mr. Clyde Donnelly," he said. "And I am better with legs than words most days. Let us see to your cousin." The town of Ellsworth in that autumn of 1874 was not a place built for gentleness. It squatted on the Kansas plain, where the Union Pacific tracks split the grass like a wound that never fully closed, and every season the cattle drives brought in a fresh tide of noise and dust, and money and desperation from the Kishom Trail. Longhorns bawled in the holding pens outside town, thousands of them, waiting to be shipped east, and the street stayed churned to mud or baked to powder depending on which way the wind had blown that week. Saloons outnumbered churches 4-1. Land speculators in city suits rubbed shoulders with drovers 3 months unwashed, and everyone, it seemed, was looking to take something from someone else before the frost came down hard and settled the matter of who would survive the winter and who would not. Clyde Donnelly had come to Ellsworth the way he came to most places, quietly, on the recommendation of men who trusted his eyes more than his gun. He had scouted for army surveying parties out toward the Smoky Hill River, had guided cattle buyers safely through country where Comanche raiding parties still occasionally tested the treaty lines, had a reputation, modest but solid, for a man who noticed things other men missed and who solved problems without unnecessary noise. He had bought the land west of town on a whim, or something closer to a whim than he usually allowed himself, thinking he might finally build something that stayed put instead of following the next herd or the next survey line. He had not expected to find a fierce, dark-haired woman defending her family in his own barn on his second night sleeping under its roof. They got Thomas onto a proper cot in the corner of the barn Clyde had been using for his own bedroll, and Clyde examined the leg by lantern light while Winifred held the boy's hand and murmured to him in a language Clyde did not recognize, something with soft vowels and hard consonants that made the injured young man's face ease despite the pain. "Polish?" Clyde asked, when Thomas had drifted into an exhausted half-sleep. "My grandmother's tongue," Winifred said. "We came from the old country when I was 11. My father took a homestead claim 2 counties east, near the Saline River. He is gone now, 3 years past, and my mother followed him into the ground this last spring. It is only myself and my aunt and my 2 young cousins now, and Thomas, who came from Chicago to help us work the land because there are not enough hands otherwise." "That is a great deal of family for one woman to carry," Clyde said, checking the swelling around the break, pressing gently with 2 fingers to gauge how the bone sat beneath the skin. "It is the family I have," Winifred said simply, as though that settled the matter entirely, and something about the plainness of it struck Clyde harder than any dramatic declaration might have. The break, he told her, was bad but not impossible. The bone had not come through the skin, which was mercy enough in country where a compound fracture could as easily end in the loss of a leg as save it. But it needed setting properly and soon, and it needed a doctor's steadier hand than his own for the actual work, though he could splint it well enough to survive the ride into town. "There is a doctor in Ellsworth," Winifred said. "Dr. Ashford. But his fee," she stopped herself, jaw tightening again. "I will see he is paid," Clyde said, before he had fully decided to say it, and when she opened her mouth to argue he raised a hand. "Not out of charity, Miss Wilcox, out of plain sense. You have got a farm to run and mouths to feed, and I have got money sitting useless in a bank that has not seen enough use since I stopped following cattle herds for a living. Let a man spend his money on something worth spending it on." She studied him again with that same weighing look, and this time something in her seemed to unbend, just slightly, like a fence post easing after a hard frost thaws. "You are a strange sort of stranger, Mr. Donnelly." "I have been told that before," he said, and did not add that he had never before found himself quite so glad of the accusation. They rode into Ellsworth before dawn, Clyde driving the wagon slow and careful over the ruts, while Winifred sat in back with Thomas's head cradled in her lap, and by the time the sun cracked the horizon into long gold ribbons across the grass, Dr. Ashford had the leg set and splinted, and Thomas sleeping off a dose of laudanum in the back room of the small clapboard office that served as the town's only real medical practice. "He will mend," the doctor said, wiping his hands on a stained cloth. "Slow, and he will favor that leg some for a season, maybe longer, but he will walk. You did well to splint it before the ride, Donnelly. Might have saved the leg entirely, given how far you must have come." Clyde did not correct the assumption that he had done the splinting for a stranger's cousin out of nothing but neighborly duty. It was true enough in its way, even if the fuller truth involved a pitchfork and a woman whose eyes he could not quite stop thinking about even now, in the gray hush of the doctor's waiting room, with the smell of carbolic acid and old coffee thick in the air. "What do I owe you?" Winifred asked the doctor, and her hand had already gone to the small leather purse at her belt, the kind of gesture that spoke of a woman accustomed to counting every coin twice before spending it. "Already settled," Dr. Ashford said, glancing at Clyde. "You did not have to do that," Winifred said afterward, standing on the boardwalk outside, the morning traffic of Ellsworth already beginning to churn around them, wagons and horses and men calling out prices for hides and grain. "No," Clyde agreed. "I did not have to. I wanted to." "Why?" He considered the question longer than it probably deserved, watching the way the morning light caught the loose strands of her dark hair, the way exhaustion had carved shadows beneath her eyes without diminishing the strength in her jaw. "Because a woman who would face down an armed stranger to protect her family," he said finally, "is not a woman I am inclined to let struggle alone with a doctor's bill if I have got the means to prevent it. Call it plain decency, Miss Wilcox. I do not require anything in return." "Everyone requires something in return," Winifred said, though there was less bitterness in it than the words might have suggested, more a kind of weary wisdom. "Then let me ask for something small," Clyde said. "Let me see your land. The well you mentioned, back in the barn, before you caught yourself. Something in the way you said it told me it is more trouble than you have let on." Winifred's expression shuddered, quick as a storm window closing against wind. "That is not your concern, Mr. Donnelly." "Maybe not," he said, "but I have got a gift of sorts. Not much use for most things, but a fair use for water. I carry a divining rod, ash wood, cut it myself years back in the Ozarks. I have found water for half the ranches between here and Dodge City when their own well diggers gave up the search. It costs you nothing but an afternoon to let me look." She laughed then, short and disbelieving. "A divining rod? You are a scout and a water witch both, then." "I'm a man who has learned to trust what his hands tell him," Clyde said, "same as any tracker learns to trust what his eyes tell him about a trail. Call it superstition if you like. I have found water in 6 counties where educated men with charts and surveys found nothing but dry rock. I do not claim to understand why it works. I only know that it does, more often than chance alone would explain." Winifred looked at him for a long moment, and Clyde had the sense of being read, thoroughly and without mercy, the way she might have read a contract before signing it. "Our well ran dry 4 days past," she said finally, quietly, as though admitting a wound. "The same week nearly that you rode into this country, as it happens. My aunt says it is a bad omen. I say it is simple bad luck, the kind that finds hardworking people whether God wills it or not. Either way, we have got no water for the stock and winter coming on, and I do not know how we will manage." "Then let me look," Clyde said. "Tomorrow, once we know your cousin is settled and resting easy, let me see what I can find." She hesitated only a moment longer before nodding, once, sharp and decisive, the way she seemed to do most things. "Tomorrow, then," she said. "But I warn you, Mr. Donnelly, if you are wrong, I will not think kindly of you for wasting my afternoon." "I would not expect you to," Clyde said, and found himself smiling in a way that surprised him with its genuine warmth. "But I do not intend to be wrong." The Wilcox homestead sat 2 counties east along a shallow fold of prairie where a creek had once run reliable and now trickled thin and reluctant between banks of cracked mud. The house itself was modest but well kept, sod-walled with a proper shingle roof that spoke of hard-earned money spent wisely, and a barn beside it holding a milk cow, 4 horses, and a scattering of chickens that scattered further at Clyde's approach. Winifred's aunt, a broad, weathered woman named Agata with the same storm-colored eyes as her niece, watched Clyde's arrival with open suspicion from the doorway, a shotgun resting casual but ready in the crook of her arm. "This is the man from Ellsworth," Winifred said by way of introduction, and something about her tone, careful and a touch too neutral, made Agata's eyebrows rise a fraction. "He says he can find water." "Many men say many things," Agata replied, in accented English precise as carved stone, but she lowered the shotgun and gestured them past. Two children, a boy of perhaps 9 and a girl no older than 7, peered out from behind their mother's skirts, dark-eyed and solemn in the way of children who have already learned that adults' worry is not something to be interrupted lightly. Clyde walked the property slowly, the ash rod held loose in both hands, letting his feet carry him in the wandering pattern he had learned decades before from an old freighter in the Ozark Hills who had claimed to learn it himself from a Cherokee grandmother. Though how much of that lineage was true, and how much invention Clyde had never been certain and had long since stopped caring. What mattered was that the rod worked, more often than not, and that his own instincts, honed by years of reading terrain for army surveys and cattle trails alike, seemed to align with whatever unseen force pulled the ash wood downward when he crossed above hidden water. The old well sat near the house, its stone lip worn smooth by years of rope and bucket, and when Clyde peered down into its depths, he saw nothing but dry shadow and a scattering of loose pebbles that rattled hollow against distant stone. "How deep does this run?" he asked. 30 feet near enough," Winifred said. "My father dug it himself the second year we were here. It never failed us, not once, not through the drought summer of '71 nor any winter since. And this year it simply stopped," she said, and there was real fear beneath the words now, carefully controlled but present. No warning, no slow drying the way you would expect from drought. One week there was water at 20 feet, same as always. The next, nothing, not even damp stone. Clyde frowned at that, something in the description scratching at his attention like a burr caught in wool. "That is not natural," he said slowly. "A well running dry from drought does it gradual, the water table dropping inch by inch as the season worsens. A well stopping sudden and complete, that speaks to something else. A shift underground maybe, a new fissure opening up somewhere that redirects the flow." Or he stopped himself before finishing the thought, not wanting to alarm her with a suspicion he had not yet confirmed. "Or what Mr. Donnelly, or someone," he said carefully, "has done something to cause it, diverted the water somehow. It happens, more than folks like to admit, when land grows valuable and water grows scarce. I have seen wells poisoned before, out toward Dodge, when a cattle company wanted a homesteader's land cheap, and figured starving them of water would hurry the sale along." Winifred's face went carefully blank in the way Clyde was beginning to recognize as her particular armor against fear. "Who would want our land?" she asked. "We have got 80 acres of prairie grass and a herd of 6 milk cows. There is nothing here worth the trouble of poisoning a well." "Maybe not yet," Clyde said. "But the railroad keeps pushing west, and speculators keep following the railroad. And land that seems worthless today can seem very valuable tomorrow, once someone decides they know something the rest of us do not." He walked the ground for another hour, the rod dipping twice near the dry creek bed, once more near a stand of cottonwoods a quarter-mile from the house, and each time he marked the spot with a small cairn of stones, working with the patient thoroughness of a man who had spent years learning that haste killed more travelers than any storm or raid. "Here," he said finally, standing at the edge of the cottonwood stand, where the rod had bent so sharply downward it nearly wrenched itself from his hands. "If there is water to be found on this land, it is here, and it runs deep and strong, deeper than your father's old well. It would take real digging, weeks of it, maybe hiring hands you cannot afford, but it is here." Winifred stood beside him, staring at the marked ground as though it might yield its secrets by sheer force of her attention. "Weeks we do not have," she said quietly. "Winter is coming, Mr. Donnelly, and closing in faster than any of us would like. 6 cows and 2 children, and an aunt, and a wounded cousin cannot survive a Kansas winter, hauling every drop of water from the creek at the Hendricks place 3 miles distant." "Then we had better start digging soon," Clyde said, and the word "we" settled between them with a weight that surprised him even as he spoke it, a commitment he had not fully intended to make but found himself, upon reflection, entirely unwilling to retract. Winifred looked at him with something caught between suspicion and gratitude, an expression he suspected, did not come easily to a woman who had learned to expect little from the world and to guard fiercely what little she managed to keep. You are not obligated to dig wells for strangers, Mr. Donnelly, same as you were not obligated to pay a doctor's bill. No, he agreed. I am not obligated. But I find, Miss Wilcox, that I am inclined toward it regardless, and a man's inclinations are worth something, even in a hard country like this one. The digging began 3 days later, once Thomas was settled enough to be left in Agatha's care and Winifred could spare her own strong back for the labor. Clyde had hired 2 hands from town, drovers between herds looking for a week's work, and together the 4 of them broke ground at the cottonwood stand with picks and shovels, while the weather held its uncertain balance between summer's last warmth and winter's first true bite. It was hard, grinding work, the kind that left palms blistered and backs aching by sundown, and Clyde found himself watching Winifred with a growing admiration that had little to do with her handsome face and everything to do with the way she worked without complaint, matching the hired men shovel for shovel, refusing every offer of rest before the others took theirs. "You do not have to prove anything to me," he told her on the second evening, as they sat apart from the others sharing a tin cup of coffee gone lukewarm, the western sky burning orange and violet above the flat horizon. "I'm not proving anything to you," Winifred said, though a small, tired smile suggested she knew exactly what he meant. "I am proving it to myself. My father used to say that this land does not care whether you are a man or a woman, strong or weak, only whether you work it honestly and well. I have spent 3 years since his death proving that his daughter can hold up her end of that bargain. Seems to me you have proven it many times over already." "Seems to you," Winifred said, "because you have known me 8 days, Mr. Donnelly. My neighbors have known me 3 years, and still some of them look at me like I am a curiosity, a foreign woman playing at farming until some man comes along to marry the trouble away from her." "Then your neighbors are fools," Clyde said, with a flatness that left no room for argument, and Winifred glanced at him sideways, something warm flickering behind the storm gray of her eyes before she looked back toward the darkening horizon. They struck water on the 4th day, a thin trickle at first that widened as they dug deeper, until by sundown a proper spring had revealed itself, cold and clear and abundant, bubbling up from some deep aquifer that Clyde's rod had somehow, against all rational explanation, correctly divined. Winifred knelt at the edge of the new well and cupped water in her hands, drinking deep, and when she looked up at Clyde there were tears standing unashamed in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, and the words carried more weight than any lengthier speech might have managed. "You are welcome," Clyde said, and found himself wanting, quite badly, to reach out and brush away the single tear that had escaped down her cheek, though he restrained the impulse, uncertain whether such familiarity would be welcomed or resented. That night, after the hired hands had ridden back toward town, and Agatha had put the children to bed, Winifred sat at the small kitchen table by lamplight and wrote in a leather-bound journal that had belonged to her mother, the pages already half filled with careful, slanted handwriting in both English and Polish. "He looked at me tonight," she wrote, in the careful English she used when she wanted her thoughts kept private from Agatha's eyes, as though the mixed language itself were a kind of lock, in a way that made me forget, for one dangerous moment, everything I have taught myself about depending on no one. Clyde Donnelly is not like the men who have come courting since father died, the ones who see 80 acres and 6 cows and imagine themselves managing both, with me as an afterthought attached to the property. He asks nothing of me. He gives without seeming to expect return, and that frightens me more than any demand could, because a man who gives freely is a man I might come to need, and I have sworn since mother's death never again to need anyone who might be taken from me." She closed the journal before finishing the thought, though the thought lingered regardless, following her into uneasy sleep. The well solved, for the moment, the most immediate crisis, But it did not solve the deeper unease that had settled over Clyde since Winifred first described the sudden, unnatural way the old well had failed. He found himself, over the following week, making quiet inquiries around Ellsworth, the sort of careful questions a good scout knew how to ask without revealing the true shape of his curiosity. He learned from a bartender at the Grand Central Hotel that a land speculator named Horace Prout had been buying up water rights and adjacent parcels throughout the county for the better part of a year, always through intermediaries, always at prices just low enough to seem reasonable to desperate sellers and just high enough to avoid obvious suspicion. He learned from an old surveyor he had once guided through disputed territory near the Smoky Hill River that Prout had hired men with some knowledge of hydraulic engineering, men who understood how underground water tables connected across a watershed, how a well dug in one location might, with sufficient effort and the right geological conditions, be made to draw water away from another well some distance off, redirecting the flow through channels dug deep and quiet where no one would think to look. He learned from a freight agent at the railroad depot that Prout had recently filed papers with the county land office expressing interest in the very parcel of land Winifred's family called home, an interest filed, curiously, in the same week the old well had run dry. The pieces fit together with the grim, satisfying click of a puzzle whose picture Clyde had no desire to see completed, and yet could not now unsee. He rode out to the Wilcox homestead the following evening, finding Winifred in the barn tending to Thomas, whose leg had begun, slowly, to knit and heal beneath its splint. "I need to speak with you," Clyde said, and something in his tone must have carried the weight of the news he bore, because Winifred's face went carefully still in the way he had come to recognize as her preparation for bad tidings. "Say it plain," she said. "I have got no patience left for careful words." "Your well did not run dry by accident," Clyde said. "A man named Horace Prout has been buying up land and water rights across this county for the better part of a year, and I have reason to believe he had men dig a channel underground to redirect your water away, hoping to force your family into selling cheap once the well failed, and the winter made your position desperate." Winifred's hands went still on Thomas's bandages, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, staring at some fixed point past Clyde's shoulder, and then quietly, dangerously, she asked, "Can you prove this?" "Not yet," Clyde admitted. "It is inference built from pieces gathered across 3 conversations in town, but the pieces fit too well to be coincidence, Miss Wilcox. Prout filed papers on this land the same week your well failed." "Then we must find proof," Winifred said, standing, something hard and purposeful settling into the line of her shoulders. "I did not survive 3 years of widowed hardship on this land only to be driven off it by a speculator's greed and a poisoned well he thinks I am too foolish to question." "I did not say you were foolish," Clyde said. "I said we need proof, and proof of this kind is not easily found. Prout is careful. He works through men who can claim ignorance if questioned, and he has likely covered his tracks well enough that direct accusation would only warn him to cover them further." "Then how do we find it?" Clyde considered the question with the same patient thoroughness he brought to reading a difficult trail. "We go where men like Prout leave their careless traces," he said finally. "Land offices keep records, even of transactions meant to look innocent. Surveyors talk, when properly encouraged, about jobs that struck them as strange. And men who dig secret channels underground must hire other men to do the digging, and those men drink in saloons and talk when they have had enough whiskey to loosen their tongues. It will take time, Miss Wilcox, and careful traveling between here and Dodge City and wherever else the trail leads. But it can be done." "Then we begin tomorrow," Winifred said, and there was no question in her tone, only decision, and Clyde found himself, not for the first time, grateful that this particular woman had chosen him as an ally rather than an enemy. Their investigation carried them, over the following 2 weeks, through half a dozen small communities scattered across the Kansas plains, each one yielding another piece of the puzzle that was slowly assembling itself into the shape of Horace Prout's ambition. In the land office at Ellsworth, a clerk sympathetic to Winifred's cause and resentful of Prout's habit of tipping poorly showed them records of 6 other water rights purchases across the county, each one following the same pattern. A well failing suddenly and without explanation, followed within weeks by a low offer from an intermediary buyer, followed by a resale, months later, to Prout's own holding company at a considerably higher price. In a saloon in the railhead town of Brookville, a driller named Sykes, deep in his cups and nursing a grudge against an employer who had shortchanged his wages, told Clyde and Winifred, in exchange for the price of a bottle, about a job he had done the previous month digging a channel deep beneath a certain parcel of prairie east of Ellsworth. A job he had not understood the purpose of at the time but had since come to suspect, given the pattern of failures that followed his work across the county. "Man who hired me called himself Whitlock," Sykes said, slurring slightly, "but I have seen him since in the company of Horace Prout himself, close enough that I would wager good money Whitlock works for no one else." In Dodge City, where they traveled by rail to follow a lead about Prout's financial backers, they found a lawyer willing, for a modest fee and the promise of anonymity, to confirm that Prout's holding company had indeed filed intent to purchase papers on the Wilcox parcel, contingent on the property's abandonment or forced sale within the coming year. Each discovery deepened the danger even as it strengthened their case, because word travels fast in small communities, and by the time they returned to Ellsworth after their third excursion, it was clear that someone had noticed their inquiries. "There is a man watching the barn," Thomas said one evening, hobbling on his heeling leg to greet them at the door, his young face drawn with worry. "2 nights now. I saw him from the loft window, sitting his horse at the edge of the property, just watching." Winifred and Clyde exchanged a look that carried the full weight of shared understanding. "Prout knows," Winifred said. "Or suspects," Clyde said. "Either way, we have grown careless, or he has grown cautious, and neither is good news for us." That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion of travel, Winifred sat again at her mother's journal. The lamp burned low to conserve oil, her handwriting smaller and more hurried than usual. "I am afraid," she wrote, though I would never say the word aloud to Clyde or to Agatha or to anyone who might mistake fear for weakness. "I am afraid not for myself but for the children, for Thomas still healing, for everything my parents built with their own hands in a country that never asked whether they wanted us here. And beneath that fear, tangled up with it in a way I cannot fully separate, is another feeling entirely, one I have less practice naming." Clyde Donnelly rode 3 days to Dodge City and back without complaint, asked for nothing beyond my company and the satisfaction of solving a wrong that is not even his own to solve. And when he looks at me across a campfire or a supper table, I feel something loosen in my chest that I had thought permanently locked since my mother's death took the last of my patience for hope. I do not know what to call this feeling. I only know that I am beginning to trust it, against my own better judgment, and that terrifies me nearly as much as Prout's watching men. She did not know, could not know, that in the barn some 50 yards distant, Clyde Donnelly sat with his own small notebook, the kind he had carried on every scouting expedition for 15 years to record trail conditions and water sources and danger signs, and that on this particular night, the entries had strayed considerably from their usual practical purpose. "Winifred Wilcox does not know her own strength," he wrote, in the blunt, unadorned hand of a man more accustomed to recording facts than feelings. "I have guided cattlemen through Comanche country and surveyed rivers that have drowned better men than myself, and I have never met courage quite like hers, courage that does not announce itself with noise, but simply does what needs doing, day after day, without complaint or expectation of reward. I find myself wanting to protect her, and in the same breath knowing that she needs no protection I could offer that she has not already provided herself tenfold. What she needs," if she needs anything from me at all, is simply someone willing to stand beside her rather than in front of her. And I find, to my own surprise, that I want very badly to be that man, for as long as she will have me." Neither journal entry was shared, that night or for many nights after, and yet something in the shared silence between them, the careful, deliberate distance they maintained even as their trust deepened, spoke its own quiet language, understood by both though voiced by neither. The confrontation, when it came, arrived not through careful investigation but through sudden violence, the way danger so often does in a country still only half tamed by law and order. They had ridden into Ellsworth to file their gathered evidence with the county sheriff, a stack of testimonies and land records and Sykes's signed confession, hoping that sufficient documentation might force an official investigation into Pruitt's dealings before the man could cover his tracks further. But Pruitt, it seemed, had grown impatient with watching and waiting, and had decided that more direct methods might serve his purposes better. 3 men stopped them on the road 2 miles outside town, emerging from a stand of cottonwoods with the casual menace of men accustomed to intimidation as a tool of business. Clyde recognized the leader immediately, a broad-shouldered man with a scar bisecting one eyebrow, someone he had seen before in Ellsworth saloons in the company of speculators and cattle buyers. "Mr. Pruitt sends his regards," the scarred man said, his horse blocking the narrow road, "and a friendly suggestion that you might consider dropping whatever business you think you have with the county sheriff's office." "And if we do not consider it?" Clyde asked, his voice carrying none of the fear he felt tightening in his chest, his hand moving with careful slowness toward the rifle holstered against his saddle. "Then Mr. Pruitt suggests that accidents happen, out on the open prairie, to travelers who wander into dangerous company. Comanche raiders, road agents, all manner of unfortunate happenstance that a man cannot always predict or prevent." Winifred's hand had gone to the pistol she kept tucked into her belt, a small but serviceable weapon Clyde had noticed she carried with the easy familiarity of someone who had practiced with it more than once. "You may tell Mr. Pruitt," she said, her voice steady despite the danger, "that a woman who has survived a Kansas winter alone with 2 young children and a wounded cousin is not easily frightened by 3 men and empty threats on an open road." The scarred man's smile faded slightly at her tone, replaced by something calculating. "Brave words," he said. "We shall see how brave you remain when—" He did not finish the sentence, because Clyde's rifle was already up and aimed, faster than the scarred man had anticipated from a scout more famous for careful observation than quick action, and the sudden threat of violence hung in the air like the moment before a thunderclap. "You have made your delivery," Clyde said, his voice flat and cold in a way Winifred had not yet heard from him. "Now you may ride back to your employer and inform him that his message has been received and rejected, and that if his men trouble us again, I will make certain the sheriff hears about this encounter alongside everything else we have gathered." The standoff held for a long, tense moment, 3 armed men against 2, the balance of danger unclear, until the scarred man, calculating odds that no longer favored easy intimidation, finally spat into the dust and wheeled his horse back toward the cottonwoods. "This is not finished," he called back, as his companions followed him into retreat. "No," Clyde agreed quietly once they had gone, lowering his rifle with hands that trembled only slightly from the aftermath of adrenaline. "I do not imagine it is." They filed their evidence with the sheriff that same afternoon, a broad-shouldered man named Sheriff Tate, who listened with growing concern as the full shape of Pruitt's scheme unfolded before him, testimony and land records, and a signed confession all laid out across his desk, with the careful precision of a case built to withstand scrutiny. "This is enough to open an investigation," Tate said finally. "Though I will tell you plain, Pruitt has friends in this county, men who owe him favors or fear his influence. This will not be settled quick or easy." "We do not need it settled quick," Winifred said. "We need it settled true. Tate looked at her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his weathered features. "I will do what I can, Miss Wilcox. You have my word on that." The investigation that followed unfolded slowly over the coming weeks, the sheriff gathering additional testimony, sending inquiries to Topeka regarding the legality of Pruitt's land purchases, building a case with the patient thoroughness the situation demanded. Pruitt, for his part, grew increasingly desperate as the walls closed around his scheme, his men making 2 further attempts at intimidation, both thwarted by Clyde's careful vigilance and Winifred's steady refusal to be frightened into abandoning her claim. But it was the arrival of true winter, sudden and severe even by Kansas standards, that would ultimately determine the shape of what followed, testing both the strength of Clyde and Winifred's growing partnership and the depth of feeling neither had yet found the courage to fully voice. The blizzard descended without proper warning in the second week of November, the kind of sudden, violent storm that Kansas old-timers spoke of in hushed, respectful tones, the temperature dropping 40 degrees within a matter of hours as a front swept down from the northern plains, bringing with it wind that howled like something alive and snow that fell so thick and fast it erased the boundary between earth and sky entirely. The timing could not have been worse. Thomas's healing leg, weakened by the cold and perhaps by some infection that had crept in despite Dr. Ashford's careful treatment, had taken a sudden, alarming turn for the worse 3 days before the storm arrived, fever climbing high enough that Agatha's careful nursing could no longer manage it alone. Dr. Ashford, summoned in haste, diagnosed the beginnings of blood poisoning, a condition that would prove fatal within days without proper medicine that existed only in the town of Ellsworth's small pharmacy, some 14 miles distant from the Wilcox homestead, and now cut off by a storm that made the prairie roads not merely difficult but genuinely deadly. "I will go," Winifred said, already reaching for her heaviest coat, her face pale but resolute in the lamplight of the sick room where Thomas lay shivering despite the fever burning through him. "You will die trying," Agatha said, her own fear making her voice sharper than usual. "No one can find their way through that storm, Winifred. The snow has already erased the road. Then I will die trying to save him rather than sit here watching him die for want of medicine we could have fetched." It was Clyde, standing in the doorway with snow already melting on his shoulders from his own trip to secure the barn animals against the storm, who spoke the words that changed the shape of what followed. "I will go," he said. "I know this land better than any road marker, and I have crossed worse storms than this one guiding army survey parties through the territories. My eyes are trained for exactly this kind of blindness." "You cannot see through a Kansas blizzard any better than the rest of us," Winifred said, though something in her voice suggested she was already searching for the argument that would let her believe otherwise, because Thomas needed the medicine and someone needed to bring it, and she could not bear to lose another person she loved to a country that seemed determined to take everything from her. "No," Clyde agreed, "but I do not need to see the road, Winifred. I need only to trust what I have learned about reading land even when eyes fail, the lay of a fence line beneath drifted snow, the sound of the creek beneath its ice, the position of the wind against my face telling me which direction holds true north. I have done this before. I can do it again." "It is too dangerous," Winifred said, and for the first time since he had known her, Clyde heard real fear in her voice, fear not for herself but for him, and something in his chest tightened at the recognition. "Everything worth doing in this country is dangerous," he said gently. "But Thomas will die without that medicine, and I am the one best equipped to fetch it. Let me go, Winifred. Trust me to come back." She looked at him for a long, searching moment, snow still melting from his shoulders, his face set with the same quiet determination she had first seen in her barn weeks before, and finally, with visible reluctance, she nodded. "Take the gray mare," she said. "She is surer-footed than the others in bad ground, and take this." She pressed into his hands a small compass, brass and worn smooth with age. "It was my father's." He always said a man who trusts his instincts and checks them against true north rarely loses his way entirely. Clyde closed his fingers around the compass, warm from her touch, and something passed between them in that moment that neither had words for yet, though both felt its weight. "I will return," he said, "before dawn if the storm allows it. Have the fire built high and the door watched. Clyde." Winifred's voice caught on his name in a way she had not allowed it to before, and when he turned back to look at her, she crossed the small distance between them and pressed something into his other hand. A folded scrap of paper, hastily written. "Do not read it now," she said, her cheeks coloring despite the fear still evident in her eyes. "Read it only if you find yourself lost and needing a reason to keep moving forward." He did not press her for explanation, only nodded, tucked the paper carefully into his breast pocket alongside her father's compass, and stepped out into the howling white chaos of the storm. The ride into Ellsworth was, without question, the most dangerous journey Clyde Donnelly had undertaken in 15 years of scouting frontier country. The wind came from the northwest in relentless gusts that drove snow sideways with such force it stung exposed skin like grape shot. And within the first mile Clyde had lost all visual reference beyond the gray mare's ears and the immediate few feet of ground before her hooves. He trusted, as he had told Winifred he would, not his eyes but his accumulated years of reading land by other senses. The particular crunch of snow over the frozen creek bed that told him he had crossed correctly at the ford, the subtle shift in wind direction as the road bent southward, past a stand of trees he could not see but knew from memory must be there. Twice he checked the compass, cupping it close to his body to shield it from the wind, confirming his direction against instinct that screamed with uncertainty in the featureless white void surrounding him. Both times, the compass agreed with his sense of the land, and he pressed onward, the mare's breath steaming in ragged plumes, ice forming in her mane, both rider and horse pushing through cold that had begun to seep past coat and glove into the deeper warmth of blood and bone. Somewhere past the halfway point, lost enough in the storm's endless white that even his trained instincts had begun to waver, Clyde remembered the paper folded in his breast pocket. He drew rein for a moment, sheltering as best he could in the meager lee of a low rise, and with fingers gone stiff and clumsy from cold, unfolded Winifred's hasty note. "I do not know how to say what I feel," the note read, in handwriting hurried but legible despite its haste, "so I will say it here, in words you may never read if all goes well and you return before needing this courage. I have spent 3 years teaching myself that I need no one. That dependence is a weakness I cannot afford in a country that takes everything from those foolish enough to love too deeply. You have made me question that lesson, Clyde Donnelly, more thoroughly than I care to admit, and if you are reading this now, lost in a storm that threatens to take you from me before I have found the courage to say these words aloud, then know that I love you, foolishly and completely, and that I need you to come back to me not because I cannot survive without you, but because I do not wish to survive a world in which you are absent from it." Clyde read the words twice through despite the wind trying to tear the paper from his frozen fingers, and something in his chest that had gone cold and mechanical with survival instinct suddenly blazed hot, with purpose, entirely separate from mere duty or obligation. He folded the note carefully back into his pocket, checked the compass once more, and pressed the mare forward into the storm with renewed determination, because now he was not merely fetching medicine for a dying young man. He was riding toward a woman who had just, in the most vulnerable way available to her, told him that she loved him, and he intended, with every fiber of stubborn will he possessed, to survive long enough to say the words back to her face. He reached Ellsworth 2 hours later, half frozen, snowblind but alive, and roused the pharmacist from his bed with pounding fists against the shuttered door, explaining the emergency in words made clumsy by cold stiffened lips. "You will not make it back through this," the pharmacist said, once he had assembled the necessary medicine, real alarm in his voice as he studied Clyde's frost-pale face. No man could navigate that storm twice in one night. A young man's life depends on this medicine reaching him before dawn, Clyde said. I will find a way. The return journey proved harder than the first, the storm having worsened rather than abated, and twice Clyde nearly lost his bearing entirely, saved only by the compass, by the memory of Winifred's note tucked warm against his heart, by a stubborn refusal to accept that he might fail her now, having come this far. When the gray mare finally stumbled, exhausted, into the familiar shape of the Wilcox barn, false dawn was just beginning to gray the eastern horizon, and Clyde half fell from the saddle, medicine bottle clutched tight against his chest, into Winifred's waiting arms. "You are alive," she breathed, relief and disbelief warring across her frost-reddened face, half supporting his weight as his legs threatened to give way beneath the accumulated exhaustion of the journey. "I told you I would return," Clyde managed, through lips gone numb with cold. "I read your note, Winifred." Somewhere past the halfway mark, when I had lost my bearing entirely, I read it, and it gave me exactly the reason I needed to keep moving forward through that storm. Winifred's eyes widened, color flooding her cheeks despite the cold. "You were not meant to read it unless I needed a reason to keep moving forward," Clyde finished. "I needed that reason, Winifred, and you gave it to me, and I intend, now that I have survived to say so, to tell you plainly that I love you too, foolishly and completely, exactly as you wrote in that note, and I have no intention of letting a Kansas winter or a scheming land speculator or anything else stand between us going forward." Whatever response Winifred might have made was interrupted by Agata's urgent call from the house, and both of them hurried inside where the medicine was administered to Thomas with careful, practiced hands, the fever-racked young man swallowing the doses with the last of his failing strength while Dr. Ashford, summoned earlier and now waiting anxiously through the storm's duration, monitored his pulse with quiet concentration. The medicine worked, slowly but certainly, over the following hours, the fever breaking just as full dawn broke gray and exhausted-looking over a landscape transformed into an endless white expanse by the night's storm. Thomas slept, finally peaceful, his breathing evened and his color returning by slow degrees, and only then did the full weight of the night's exhaustion catch up with Clyde, who found himself, quite without deciding to, asleep in a kitchen chair before Winifred had even finished thanking him properly. She did not wake him. Instead, she covered him with a spare blanket, brushed the frost-melted hair back from his forehead with a tenderness that surprised her with its intensity, and sat beside him through the remainder of the morning, watching him sleep with an expression that mixed relief and love, and a fierce, protective gratitude she had rarely allowed herself to feel for anyone since her parents' deaths. When he finally woke, near midday, the storm had passed into the clear, brutal cold that so often follows a Kansas blizzard, and he found Winifred sitting beside him still, having barely moved through the intervening hours. "You should have slept yourself," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion but his eyes soft as they found hers. "I could not," she admitted. "I was too busy thanking whatever Providence saw fit to send me a stranger with a divining rod and an ashwood staff who happened to be looking for land the same week my well ran dry, a stranger who turned out to be exactly the man I did not know I needed." Clyde reached out, slow and deliberate, and took her hand in his, calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt, despite its simplicity, like the most natural thing he had ever done. "I meant what I said in the storm," he said. "I love you, Winifred Wilcox. I have loved you, I think, since the moment you held a pitchfork to my throat and refused to be intimidated by a stranger twice your size standing in your borrowed barn." Winifred laughed, soft and genuine, tears standing bright in her eyes despite the laughter. "That is a strange beginning for a love story." "Every good story needs a strange beginning," Clyde said. "It makes the ending mean more when it finally arrives." They did not speak further of endings that morning, both of them too exhausted and too full of quiet, hard-won joy to rush toward anything beyond the simple comfort of sitting together, hands joined, while the household slowly woke around them into the ordinary business of a winter morning, following a night of crisis survived. But the matter of Horace Prout remained unresolved, and it was this unfinished business that would demand their attention over the following weeks, as the investigation Sheriff Tate had promised finally began to yield results substantial enough to force a confrontation neither Clyde nor Winifred had anticipated arriving in quite the manner it did. The break came from an unexpected source. Whitlock, the engineer who had directed the underground channel digging on Prout's behalf, arrested in Dodge City on an unrelated matter of fraud and eager, once faced with the prospect of extended imprisonment, to trade information for leniency. His confession, detailed and specific, named not only the Wilcox well but 4 others across the county, provided precise locations of the diversion channels, and confirmed Prout's direct involvement in ordering the sabotage as part of a systematic scheme to depress land values before forcing sales at prices far below true worth. Armed with this confession alongside their previously gathered evidence, Sheriff Tate rode out with a small posse to Prout's ranch headquarters on a cold, clear morning in early December, Clyde and Winifred accompanying them at the sheriff's request, since their testimony would be needed to formally file the charges. Prout, when confronted, proved neither as dangerous nor as dignified as the scale of his scheme might have suggested. He was a soft-handed man in an expensive coat, more accustomed to negotiating from positions of financial leverage than facing direct legal accusation, and his composure crumbled within minutes of Sheriff Tate laying out the evidence against him. "This is nothing but the word of a disgruntled engineer and a foreign woman's grievance," Prout tried, though the tremor in his voice undercut the bravado of his words. "It is rather more than that, Mr. Prout," Sheriff Tate said. "It is signed testimony, land office records, and a confession detailed enough to satisfy any judge in this territory. You will come with us now quietly, or I will be obliged to make this considerably less pleasant for you." Prout's men, gathered around the ranch house, made no move to intervene, their loyalty evidently insufficient to risk their own arrest alongside their employers, and within the hour Prout was in custody, his scheme laid bare before the full weight of territorial law, his scarred enforcer and other hired men scattering before the law could gather sufficient evidence to charge them as accomplices. The trial, when it came the following spring, proved almost anticlimactic after the drama of its preceding months, Prout's guilt established beyond reasonable doubt by the accumulated evidence. His sentence, a substantial term of imprisonment, alongside the forfeiture of his illegally acquired landholdings, several of which, including the water rights improperly seized from neighboring farms, were returned to their rightful owners by court order. But by the time the trial concluded, Clyde and Winifred had already built together something far more significant than the simple resolution of a legal case. The winter had passed, slow and hard as Kansas winters always were, but softened by a partnership that deepened with each passing week. Clyde had moved his modest belongings from the barn on his own land to a small room in the Wilcox house. At Agata's insistence, once the older woman had fully satisfied herself of his character and intentions, and through the long, cold months he had made himself useful in 100 small ways. Mending fences, hunting game to supplement the family stores, teaching young Peter, Winifred's cousin, how to read trail sign in the snow, sitting beside Thomas through the young man's slow, steady recovery, sharing quiet evenings with Winifred by lamplight that gradually stretched later and later as neither wished to be the first to suggest sleep. They had not rushed toward marriage, both of them too practical, too accustomed to hard-won trust, to treat the matter as anything but a decision requiring the same careful consideration they brought to every other significant choice in their lives. But by the time the last snow melted into the muddy thaw of March, and green shoots began pushing up through the black Kansas soil, the question had settled itself between them with the same quiet certainty that had characterized their partnership from its earliest days. "I have been thinking," Winifred said one evening, as they sat together on the porch step watching the sunset paint the thawing prairie in gold and rose, "that a man who finds water where none should exist, and who rides through blizzards to fetch medicine, and who has made himself so thoroughly useful to my family that my aunt now scolds him same as she scolds her own nephews, might as well make the arrangement permanent." Clyde turned to look at her, a smile spreading slow and genuine across his weathered features. "Are you proposing marriage to me, Winifred Wilcox?" "I am suggesting," Winifred said, with the particular dignity she brought to even her most vulnerable moments, "that neither of us has ever been especially traditional in our approach to courtship, given that ours began with a pitchfork and continued through a criminal investigation and a near-fatal blizzard. I do not see why the proposal itself should follow convention any more closely." "No," Clyde agreed, taking her hand in his, the same gesture that had become so familiar over the preceding months. "I do not suppose it should. Winifred Wilcox, I love you more than I have loved anything in this life, more than the open trail, more than the satisfaction of solving a difficult problem, more than any comfort I have ever found in solitude. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Winifred said without hesitation, the word carrying the full weight of everything they had survived together. "Though I warn you, Clyde Donnelly, marrying me means marrying this land and this family, and all the complicated, difficult, wonderful mess that comes with both." "I would not have it any other way," Clyde said, and kissed her then, gentle and certain, sealing a promise that both of them intended to keep for whatever remained of their lives together. They married in May, in a small ceremony at the Ellsworth Church attended by Agatha and the children, by Thomas walking now with only the faintest limp remaining from his injury, by Sheriff Tate and Dr. Ashford, and a handful of neighbors who had, over the intervening months, come to respect Winifred's resilience and Clyde's quiet competence in equal measure. The ceremony was simple, the celebration afterward modest but joyful, held in the Wilcox farmyard beneath a sky finally settled into spring's gentle warmth, the old dry well long since filled in, and the new spring at the Cottonwood stand running strong and reliable, providing water enough now not just for the Wilcox stock, but for 2 neighboring farms as well, generosity Winifred had insisted upon once the immediate crisis of scarcity had passed. They built their life together with the same careful, practical partnership that had characterized their courtship, Clyde's scouting work gradually giving way to full-time farming as he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he preferred the steady rhythm of tending land he could call his own to the wandering uncertainty of guide work, though he never fully abandoned the skills that had defined his earlier years. Occasionally called upon by neighboring farms when a well-needed divining or a lost traveler needed finding in difficult country, Winifred continued to run her family's expanded holdings with the same fierce competence she had always shown, the addition of Clyde's land to her own creating a modest but comfortable prosperity that neither of them had anticipated when they first met across the point of a pitchfork in a borrowed barn. 2 years passed in this manner, the farm prospering, the family growing closer, Thomas eventually striking out to claim his own small parcel of land nearby, young Peter and his sister growing tall and capable under both Clyde and Winifred's patient teaching. And through it all, the love between the 2 central figures of this story deepened rather than diminished, tested by hardship and strengthened by shared purpose in exactly the manner that the best partnerships, forged in difficult country, so often are. On a warm evening in the autumn of 1876, exactly 2 years after their wedding, Clyde and Winifred sat together on the same porch step where he had first properly proposed, watching their land stretch golden and prosperous toward a horizon neither of them had ever imagined sharing with such contentment. "Do you ever regret it?" Winifred asked, her head resting against his shoulder in the easy comfort of long partnership. "Settling down, I mean, rather than continuing your wandering life." Yes. Clyde considered the question with the same careful thoroughness he brought to every decision, watching the sun sink slow and golden toward the flat Kansas horizon, the well he had found still running strong and clear a quarter-mile distant, the family they had built together sleeping safe within the walls of the house behind them. "I spent 15 years reading trail sign for other men's purposes," he said finally, "guiding cattle drives and survey parties toward destinations that were never truly my own. I do not regret those years, Winifred. They taught me everything I needed to know to be useful to you when it mattered most. But I have found in the 2 years since a purpose far more satisfying than any trail I ever guided, the purpose of building something permanent, alongside a woman brave enough to hold a pitchfork to a stranger's throat in defense of her family, and wise enough to recognize, eventually, that the stranger meant her no harm at all. I recognized it rather sooner than you give me credit for," Winifred said, smiling against his shoulder. "Did you?" "I recognized it," she said, "the moment you offered to pay a doctor's bill for a stranger's cousin without expecting anything in return. I simply required a bit more time to admit what that recognition meant." Clyde laughed, low and warm, and pressed a kiss to the crown of her dark hair, still escaping its kerchief in the same manner it had the very first night they met. "Well," he said, "I am glad in the end that both of us arrived at the same conclusion, however different our paths toward it." They sat together as the sun finished its descent, the sky deepening into the particular violet blue of a Kansas evening in early autumn, the temperature already beginning its seasonal slide from the day's lingering warmth toward the sharper chill that would define the coming winter. But this time, unlike the uncertain autumn of their first meeting, neither of them faced that seasonal turn with anything but confidence, having built together, through hardship and investigation and a desperate ride through blinding snow, a partnership sturdy enough to weather whatever the changing seasons might yet bring. The well at the Cottonwood stand continued running clear and strong for many years afterward, sustaining not only the Wilcox-Donnelly farm but, in the fullness of time, the small community that gradually grew up around that reliable water source, families drawn by the promise of good land and honest neighbors, several of them recruited personally by Winifred from among the immigrant communities she had known in her youth. Families like her own, who needed only a fair chance and steady water to build something lasting on the Kansas prairie. Horace Prout served his sentence in the territorial prison and emerged, some years later, a broken and largely forgotten man, his once substantial fortune dissolved in legal fees and forfeited holdings, his name remembered in Ellsworth primarily as a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed unchecked by conscience. Thomas married a young woman from a neighboring homestead 2 years after his own recovery, settling on land not far from his cousin's growing farm, the two families remaining close through every subsequent season, gathering each autumn for a harvest celebration that Agata insisted upon organizing with the same fierce dedication she brought to every family matter. And Clyde Donnelly, once a wandering scout who trusted his hands and eyes to read a country other men found impenetrable, found in Winifred Wilcox and the land they built together the one destination his years of guiding had somehow always been leading him toward, though he had not recognized the journey's true purpose until the moment a pitchfork-wielding immigrant woman had refused to be frightened by a stranger in her barn, choosing instead to trust her own judgment about a man's true character. A judgment that proved, in the fullness of time, entirely and beautifully correct. They grew old together on that Kansas land, their partnership deepening through every season it weathered. The divining rod that had found their well eventually retired to a place of honor above the fireplace mantel, a reminder, whenever either of them glanced toward it, of the strange, sudden, entirely providential way that love had found them both in a season uncertain between warmth and frost, and had chosen, against all reasonable expectation, to stay.